The research report is titled The Narrative of Islam and Sexual Diversity and Anatomy of Attitudes, Challenges, Opportunities and Trends in the South African context.
Assalamu alaikum everybody. I want to take this time to thank you for participating in this seminar where we are presenting a research which we conducted as an organization. I think AKS mentioned about the history of this research. Basically, this research was conducted here in South Africa in 4 provinces, Eastern Cape, Western Cape, Gauteng and KwaZulu-Natal. And our unit of analysis were clear Muslims, straight Muslims, as well as academic participants who conducted extensive research on the field of Islam and sexual diversity. It took us about 3 months to complete this research and also to put the findings together. I will go directly into the Muslim community's views on homosexuality. The mainstream view is that the Quran unequivocally states that homosexuality is haram. Homosexuality is regarded as an aberrant sexual orientation which defies the natural order. The story of creation is used to support the binary view of sexual orientation and gender identity. This is the main view in the Muslim community, that homosexuality is explicitly condemned in the Quran, with particular reference to the story of Lut, which is regarded as a story in which the Prophet Lut preached against homosexuality, and as a result of people's disobedience, the twin cities of Sodom and Gomorrah were destroyed because of that. So this is the orthodox interpretation, and also there are some various hadith collections which are also used to support this point of view. But when we look at the story of Lut, there was an alternative view that was given, particularly by academic participants, who condemned that the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah was not necessarily because of homosexuality, but it was because of the commission of a myriad of malpractices, which includes the refusal or the unwillingness to accept Lut as a true prophet. Also hostility to strangers. And as we know that hadith collections, they are suspects. The view is that there are just a few hadith which are authentic, with many of them being suspect. But actually, regardless of the view is that I didn't see the element of trying to look at the authenticity of the hadith. When it comes to the relationship between Islam and sexual diversity, you see hadith is regarded as one of the bedrocks of what is regarded as there is a view in which homosexuality is not acceptable in Islam. Then there is also a story about the history of Islam as well as homosexuality. There is a view, and it's quite strong, that if you look at the historical trajectory of Islam, it was not necessarily associated with issues with homosexuality. So homosexuality is seen as a recent development which is being imposed on Islam, particularly by the West through the human rights and democracy agenda. So some of the participants are very critical of democracy and human rights because they view these developments as giving people the liberty to go beyond what they consider to be acceptable in terms of social behavior and interaction. But from academic participants who participated in this research, there's a view that if you look at homosexuality and Islam, these two identities are intrinsically compatible. It is actually, homosexuality is embedded in the history of Islam, and it is a social reality that cannot be denied, that cannot be run, that we cannot run away. But the challenge is to change the attitudes of a community which thinks that Islam does not accept homosexuality. Then there is this interesting denial that there are no homosexuals in Islam. And this denial is particularly based on the view that these identities, they are mutually exclusive. They are inherently antithetical to each other, so they cannot coexist. You cannot be a homosexual and a Muslim. The argument is that even if you are a Muslim, and at the point when you start to identify as a queer person, automatically your Muslim identity disappears. So the view is that you cannot have a Muslim who is queer. So it is all those the people who are Muslim and queer, they are regarded to be outside of the fold of Islam. Then there's a minority view that homosexuality is a punishment from Allah, as I explained. I gave an example during my speech. And also that homosexuality is responsible for some social problems, including immorality and the HIV and AIDS scourge. And there are basically two levels of association which the mainstream Muslim community strongly dislike when it comes to their interaction with queer Muslims. And this is the spiritual level and the family level. At the family level, you would see that if you ask somebody, for example, generally what should be done to queer Muslims, somebody will tell you that okay, they should be prayed for, they should be counseled, they should go through probably sexual reassignment surgery. And when you ask the same person that what would you do if you discover that one of your family member is queer, the same person who says they should be prayed for would say, I will ostracize that person. Which means as the social space between a heterosexual Muslim and a queer Muslim closes or come closer, the scale of homophobia begins to go high. So the worst thing that can happen to the Muslim family is to have one of their family members as a queer person. That's why many say they would ostracize a family Muslim member. And in terms of spiritual interaction, there is also a general belief that queer Muslims should not pray with others in the same mosque. It is regarded as a profane conduct for a queer Muslim to get into the same mosque with others. And the question as to whether a heterosexual Muslim would participate in a prayer session which is led by a queer imam was regarded by many as insulting. Actually, a couple of respondents terminated the interview when they were asked would you participate in a prayer session which is led by a queer imam. And the idea is that, the view is that given the role of imams in Islam, allowing queer imams to conduct prayer sessions would be a development that would enable Islam to rot from the head. So there is something which is totally unacceptable from the view of the mainstream Muslim community. Then there is also a minority who believe that it is indeed haram or forbidden to engage in discussion on Islam and sexual diversity. And some of the respondents or some of the potential respondents refused to participate in the interview because they consider it haram, which then shows us the degree to which the agenda to educate people on issues of queer people, the challenges that the agenda faces, because people are not necessarily ready and willing to engage this dialogue. On the issues of Islam, of queer Muslims and family, marriage, adoption of children, 89% believe that it is not acceptable for queer Muslims to adopt children. And the major view is that people question the kind of children that will be raised by queer Muslims. And part of the issue is that it will also empower queer Muslims to push the agenda forward of queer people, and also to socialize children into being queer people. So it is quite totally unacceptable for queer Muslims to adopt children. Then the level of homophobia decreases when it comes to issues of the provision of social services such as health and education, with 86% believing that queer Muslims should have equal access to education, health, and all other services. And what probably explains this is because of the legislative edifice that South Africa has, which criminalizes any forms of discrimination, an indication that democracy can play a very important role in changing attitudes and in making people conform even to those beliefs that they don't actually want to conform to. I think I touched a bit on the issue of dialogue. You see, when asked whether participants would engage dialogue on Islam and sexual diversity, about 62% said they will engage dialogue. But when they proceed in their responses, they would say, the purpose that I will engage dialogue is that I want to know what is wrong with queer Muslims. Which means this kind of, it is not necessarily the willpower to engage a dialogue, because the idea is not to seek an understanding of queer people from their experiences and frame of reference. I will go to the challenges and coping strategies. The first formidable challenge that is faced by queer Muslims is rejection, is ostracization by their families, by their friends and their communities. At a point when one starts to identify as queer, and especially if you come out, you start to face a lot of those challenges. The social space becomes so homophobic. And this particular challenge has a lot of consequences, which can be social, economic, psychological, and as well as spiritual. Then we have homophobia, we have discrimination, we have harassment, we have many forms of abuses. Some of the abuses are detailed in the research report. I cannot delve into them now. Then there's also the challenge of reconciling Islam and sexual orientation. This challenge, the moment that one identifies as a queer person, you know, you are living in a society where the socialization is heteronormative, and you acquire that socialization through years and years of indoctrination. So the moment you identify as a queer person, that socialization, which I call the straight socialization, will inevitably come into conflict with the identity with a queer identity. And when that happens, you can face a lot of challenges at personal level, which can be spiritual, which can be social, which can be psychological. And I think this explains why TIC is one of its programs, which is called the National Personal Empowerment Program, which is specifically geared towards enabling queer Muslims to be able to reconcile their sexual identity with their faith. I will go to the coping strategies. One of the coping strategies to abandon Islam as well as one's family. The primary reason is to try and find a new lease of life outside what I would call a geography of homophobia. So you would see some queer Muslims abandoning their faith. The abandonment can be total, it can be partial or complete abandonment, with a few respondents turning into atheism as a way of coping with the ostracization by their families and friends and communities. Then we have substance abuse. I think that one is self-explanatory. We have prayer. A couple of queer Muslims believe that, spiritual edification is very essential for them to try and cope with their challenges. So the best thing they can do to edify themselves spiritually is through prayer. But the challenge of spiritually edifying themselves is that they are excluded in spiritual places such as mosque. There are very few progressive imams who can assist them in their journey of reconciliation. So this is a very big challenge when it comes to the need to spiritually edify themselves. Then self-acceptance. I think this one is self-explanatory. Then coming out a queer-friendly social space. This is one of the most important strategies which are used. And this strategy involves the creation of a social niche of people and organizations which are queer-friendly. And also inclusive mosques and progressive imams have a very essential position in this social space which is queer-friendly. And it provides a space, this space provides a sense of belonging. Because essentially human beings need to belong, they are social animals by their very nature. So whereas the geography of homophobia provides a space for rejection, a queer-friendly social space provides a space for belonging, which is very important in cultivating an inner dispensation in terms of one's spiritual life. And also it allows queer Muslims to exercise their religion within a social space where they are not necessarily charged. We also gathered views on coming out of the closet, and there are basically two views. One view portrays the closet as a place of oppression where queer Muslims will be living a lie. They are not living their lives, they are living someone else's life. That is the view. And it was all perceived as a way of submission, of conforming to the heteronormative social space at the expense of liberty, freedom, dignity, and equality. Coming out is also regarded as a new lease of life in which someone is empowered and is liberated from oppression and suppression by the mainstream Muslim community. And also another advantage of coming out is that it helps to queer Muslims to create a network of individuals and organizations that work to fight for inclusivity. And it also enables queer Muslims to fight against homophobia. The other view of coming out, this view sees coming out not as something that is very positive, and it sees the closet not something that is very negative. From this view, the closet is not as bad a space as it is often assumed. It enables sexual orientation, the sexual orientation of queer people, to flourish without needing to engage the public constantly about the sexual orientation. And also the idea that there are consequences of coming out which are very difficult to shoulder. And that sexual orientation should be restricted to the public space, to the private space, I mean. It should not be the business of the public sphere to know people's sexual orientation. And this view is a minority view that coming out is a Western view of sexuality, which seeks to give sexual orientation a public face, when indeed sexual orientation should have a private space. But the general, if you look at all the arguments about coming out, I know that the general view is that coming out is a decision which should be made at a personal level, depending on circumstances, and these circumstances differ from case to case. For example, some queer Muslims could not come out at a specific time because of the socio-economic consequences of coming out. In particular, a particular queer Muslim said that I couldn't come out because I was afraid that would mean the end of my education. My parents were going to stop paying for me, but I needed at least to finish my A-level. So you see that there are a lot of considerations that you have to take in order to make the decision whether to come out or not, or whether it is proper for you to come out at a specific period or not. In terms of the way forward, there's a general agreement that at the policy levels, South Africa has made significant strides in trying to end all forms of discrimination. But this policy progress did not trickle down to the grassroots level. So we still have a lot of challenges. We still have this embedded homophobia. So the challenge is now to change attitudes on the ground level. And there's also belief among queer people that if you look at the orthodox interpretations of Islamic texts which are used to justify the rejection of homosexuality in Islam, the view is that such interpretations are out of the letter and spirit of the Quran, particularly the issue of diversity, that the Quran itself values diversity, and that even diversity is naturally part of the creation matrix. So the idea is that when you discriminate people on the basis of their sexual orientation or any other basis, you are actually defying the principle of diversity, which is one of the cornerstones of principles in the Quran. And there's a general belief that what explains the level of homophobia in South Africa, and I believe in other contexts as well, is that the mainstream Muslim community does not have knowledge about queer people. And it is this lack of knowledge that drives the homophobia agenda forward. And it's dispiriting that we have discussed the attitudes of the Muslim community towards homosexuality. And then these attitudes are based on the lack of knowledge from the views of queer Muslims. And there is lack of willingness to engage dialogue, because it is in and through this dialogue that this knowledge deficit might be addressed in order to change attitudes. So it's a very complex issue. It's a very complex issue. So in order to address this knowledge deficit, the way forward is to engage education, is to engage advocacy, is to engage awareness campaigns as tools through which to change the government. Sorry, to change the attitudes. And then there are a number of actors which should be involved from the views of the queer Muslim community. It's not an agenda which a single actor will be able to achieve, but it's an agenda which requires cooperation and collaboration from different stakeholders. Among the stakeholders which were frequently mentioned are the government. The government, particularly because it is responsible for crafting the overall framework within which people relate with each other. So in terms of policy, in terms of institutional support and capacity building, the government plays a very central role. And even in terms of partnering with public as with the private institutions, including non-governmental organizations, in order to try and change attitudes. Then we have not-for-profit organizations. They were also mentioned as one of the important players in bringing about change, particularly because of their willingness to stand in the gap, to stand and fight for the cause of human rights and inclusivity, particularly because they have the capacity to engage education programs, to engage advocacy programs, and to engage awareness campaigns programs. We have our religious leaders. Now, religious leaders are like sitting on the fence. They can either propagate homophobic attitudes, and the main view which was raised here is that they are established religious leaders, they are established religious institutions which are propagating homophobic attitudes. And given their influence in the Muslim community, these attitudes become so pronounced in the community. So the idea is that the religious leaders should interpret Islamic texts in ways which are inclusive, in ways which are anti-homophobic, and should propagate anti-homophobic views and attitudes in the Muslim community. We have teachers, particularly because there are cases of discrimination, cases of harassment against queer people, which are taking place in public and private schools. And there's generally low willingness and incapacity administratively to deal with such issues. And also that the teachers and the education sector is one of the primary organizations that play a role in the socialization process. So the idea is to proffer the socialization that is inclusive as far as issues of gender identity and sexual orientation are concerned. Then we have our activists. These can be human rights, gender, queer Muslims. They are also important in this regard because they are not only willing to support the queer agenda at policy level, but they're also willing to support, to give even private support to the policy, to the queer agenda. And I have not included the views specifically of the academic participants. I interviewed 11 academic participants, and out of those 11 participants, they are from Eastern Cape, Gauteng, and KwaZulu-Natal. With regards to academics, the majority of the academics are also of the orthodox view that Islam does not accept homosexuality. And like the mainstream Muslim community, the argument is based on the text, especially the story of Luke and also the Hadith. But there were a few academics who were progressive in their interpretation of Islamic text, and I will just explain some of the views of one of the academics. She argued that whether it is acceptable or not for Muslims to be queer is not the issue, because the issue is that the social reality is that they are Muslims who are queer people. But she kind of say the arguments which are raised by those people who support homosexuality and those people who say homosexuality is not acceptable, these arguments are not convincing enough. So she suggests that there is need for more textual work to be done. But the starting point for those who argue that homosexuality is acceptable is to use the concept of diversity in the Quran. That's the starting point. That's where a strong case can be built in terms of Islam and sexual orientation. In terms of reconciliation of Islam and sexual diversity, she argues that the spirit is ungendered. It does not matter whether you are heterosexual, whether you are homosexual, whether you are queer in whatever way, when it comes to the way you have to relate with Allah. Your sexual orientation does not matter. So, from that point of view, there is no way you can see a conflict between your spirituality and your sexual orientation. Because when it comes to the relationship with Allah, that does not, your sexual orientation does not come into play. And she also supported the minority view that coming out is a Western ontological perspective of sexuality. That there is need for the queer Muslim agenda to make an assessment of itself and stop assuming that all queer Muslims want to disclose their sexuality, want to give their sexual orientation a public face. So basically, I can say these are the findings in